If you had to invite 5 people
Good Lord.
to your dinner party,
This you should have asked me. You told me yesterday. I'd have come prepared.
Jinnah just didn't want so many poor people in the room. Like he wanted this to be this Oxford debating society. If there won't be history in politics, where will it be in biology?
I can speak Malayalam to you.
Yeah, you can. So then we won't be able to talk.
Yeah, exactly. That's why India needs English. The Rajputs were seen as gold standard Kshatriyas, and they looked down on the Marathas. And the Marathas, I think, resented that. And still, all these hundreds of years later, still plays out, except that now it's playing out online among these online keyboard warriors, smartphone
Through
warriors.
video edits.
And through video edits. And really outraged
Laser
videos.
eyes, yeah.
Many of us romanticize the Nehruvian era, etc. Even though factually speaking, that had its own problems.
I constantly keep on hearing that Akbar was secular.
Oh yeah, that word.
Right. I mean, it doesn't mean anything.
Who is a Hindu? What is your identity? What is proper Islam? What is proper Hinduism? Many people forget that when they say, the Mughals expanded across India and invaded all parts of India, forget that it was often Rajput generals leading a lot of these armies. It was often Maratha generals also. Many Maratha families did serve the Mughals late as well.
Every time Hinduism or Brahmanical Hinduism enters an area, it will very often absorb local gods by associating them with very often Shiva, for example. I think I have a friend who calls this the federal nature of Hinduism.
When the British start doing their censuses and create this concept of majority and minority in India, the Hindus wake up to the realization that we're a majority. I think there is a trend now to, sort of encourage and push a very purist, a very rigid reading of Hinduism. Shrillness and loudness sometimes also reflects a kind of insecurity, which is why people need a danda in their hand to make people listen.
Hi, you're watching Scroll Adda. I'm Shoaib Daniyal, and we're here with historian Manu Pillai. Hi, Manu.
Hi, Shoaib. Good to finally meet you properly and to sit down after several years of bumping into each other here and there.
We had a little bit of a call yesterday, Manu, and I found it very interesting. You had one request. You said, Shoaib, don't mention where I'm from, where I live. Sorry, not where I'm from, where I live. And I was just thinking about it, and I found it so interesting or weird that you're a nerdy historian and you're worried about people finding out where you live because you're worried about safety, family, etc. When you started history, did you ever think you'd be in such a controversial field?
I mean, not to be dramatic, it's just precautions, right? Because in today's world, I've seen how people get trolled, their details get leaked. I mean, at one level, you think it's just a mobile number, but then women especially get harassed and they get rape threats and things like that. So you see some of that. And increasingly, I've realized that it's not wise to put out family members' pictures on social media, especially your public profiles and things like that. Because when a trolling season unexpectedly descends on you, there's no guarantee where it can lead. So I think it's sometimes wiser in today's world to just keep certain things completely private. But now, obviously, having said this, people are going to start looking now where I live and all of that. It's not that tough to find. But yeah, I don't actively advertise it. When I set out to do all this, no, I don't think we ever set out. We all set out in a very innocent way, right? We have certain aspirations and certain plans. But then reality hits you in various ways. I'm not whiny about it and complaining about it in the sense that all said and done, when you're having a public conversation and you're discussing history in a public-facing fashion, it's always likely that you're going to have one part of the audience that doesn't approve of you or doesn't like what you're saying, etc. And within that segment, there will always be nasty people. So you're never going to be able to evade nasty people. It's just that you can take certain precautions for your peace of mind and comfort. But no, I don't think anyone goes into this thinking that they'd have to plan for all of these contingencies.
Yeah, I mean, in school, history was the most boring, nerdy subject. But somehow in India today, there is nothing more contested than history for some reason. What do you think has led to this extreme politicization of history? I
mean, again, one side of me tells me that we shouldn't assume that we are somehow living in a very special moment. Every generation thinks that their moment is special and there's something deeply and exclusively traumatic about the time they are living in. I think, yes, many things have changed. We have social media, the internet, technology and all of that. But earlier generations also had their political ways of looking at history. Politicization happens also because there's history as a discipline where you're researching a subject and you go in trying to be objective. You're never fully objective because as human beings you can't be. But you try to minimize bias and subjectivity and you try and be as objective as possible. But history is also an emotional commodity, right? there are communities that determine their sense of self and identity through historical narratives. So when a historian of whatever leaning punctures certain elements of that narrative, it is no longer an academic exercise for them. From their perception, it feels like an emotional assault on their sense of identity. Their history becomes politicized. Their history is consciously read in a way that it has that emotional resonance for people, and people don't want that threatened or challenged. And that tussle, I think, will always continue as long as human society remains. Even right now, for example, in the age of Hindutva, many of us romanticize the Nehruvian era, etc. Even though, factually speaking, that had its own problems, it had its own censorship and all kinds of issues, right? It's just that we tend to romanticize that because we see that as a counterfoil. At some point, maybe 50 years down the line, this period might be romanticized, God knows in what way. You never know. So the thing is, communities imagine themselves in different ways, and history often becomes raw material in creating that sense of imagination and that emotional sense of self. So I think we just need to understand that there is history as discipline, as an academic process, as academic inquiry, but then there's history as public memory, as collective memory, as shared emotions, and the way people engage with the past, not necessarily through textbooks and footnotes, but through what they see as inherited experiences, inherited memories, and things like that. And the moment that happens, you're in a much more fuzzy territory where politicization is almost a natural consequence, because memory is political, emotion does become political. And then you also have, of course, that we've always had political forces that mine that for political advantage and to further certain political goals.
In fact, what you're saying reminds me, I think a long time back I was watching, We the People on NDTV, and Mani Shankar Iyer was there. And I think this was largely broadly the debate. And Mani Shankar Iyer, in his very characteristic, I just snapped. He said, if there won't be history in politics, where will it be in biology?
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
So, I mean, what you're saying, I think this idea that there's an emotional side and an academic side, I think both always kind of coexist as a yin and yang, right? Like, I mean, nationalism is what kind of, this sort of growth of modern nationalism is what gives rise to the growth of what we now call the modern discipline of academic history, right?
Yeah. And in general, I think it's not as if these things exist in separate silos entirely. In some ways, there's a continuum also. Because as I said, even the people doing history are products of this society. So everything that's happening in this society conditions us in various ways, also inflected by our own individual backgrounds, right? Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you from a certain caste background, a certain linguistic background? All of these at some level sort of affect our perception of the world, which we then bring to our academic work as well. So it's not as if this somehow is better or far more, it is scientific in its methods, but it's still human beings doing it. There's whole studies on science itself, which we assume is very rational and perfectly done. But then you realize that scientists actually inject a lot of their sensibilities into the activity of doing science. And the same thing applies to history as well. So there's also well-intentioned people, for example, in their desire.
We forget that, just on that point, a lot of 20th century racism was science. Like in its time, it was all a scientific discipline, racism, measuring skulls, and
sexism.
So on.
There's so much of it in science. There's Angela Saini, who's written a couple of books now on these themes, and it's quite interesting to see, how for generations what we thought was pure, well-distilled, objective scientific knowledge was actually not all that objective, because the scientists were not somehow immune to the things and the ideas that floated around in their society. So we're also prone to that. And I think academic history also in some ways, because we live in politically fraught times, like all generations before, but we like to think that we're in especially politically fraught times. We also, based on how we want to deal with this time, we sometimes bring that to our work, right? Sometimes because of ideological conviction, you also read history a certain way. I always make this point, there is oppression in history, but it's not the only lens through which history can be viewed. Yet, for certain political constituencies, it's important to highlight that, and with good reason. You do need to understand that. But to understand history in a holistic way, that can't be the only lens. But again, because we have ideological fault lines, depending on where we are parked on these, across these borders, ideological borders, we end up sometimes choosing certain prisms as well. So it's all quite mixed up, to be honest. I think I've increasingly realized that there is no pure virtuous history that's possible. I think no matter how much you try, the creatures doing the history end up influencing the product as well.
I think at best you can sort of choose what to focus on. Like, I think when you're talking about identity and academic discipline, I think everybody agrees that there is a link. It's just that maybe the left will say we should focus on maybe an oppressed community, and maybe the right would say no, maybe, I don't know, we should focus on nationalism. I mean, I think it's on the left, for example, in the West or in America, it's a good thing to focus on, say, Black history, and I kind of agree. Like, so, but the thing is, at the end of the day, this idea that identity is linked to history is something that everybody agrees on,
and everyone may not acknowledge it, but one way or the other, they're all succumbing to that pressure. The other day, I was listening to something about minorities and things like that, but talking about sexual minorities, etc. And it struck me that that framework of majority, minority, it's been applied to practically everything now, right? And it helps us see the world in a certain way. It clarifies many things for us, but perhaps in a certain way, if you think about it, also limits us in other ways, right? We turn into monoliths, things that are not monoliths. You know, it's not like when you say a sexual minority is somehow everybody is the same. There also there's a spectrum. There also there's diversity within. Within the minority, there'll be a dominant voice, and there might be voices that have been cornered and marginalized. So then how do you make sense of all of this if our prisons itself are not always perfect? So I think historians also, we need to live with the basic humility of understanding that what we are doing isn't somehow perfect or virtuous or anything. At least that's how I deal with history. I have this whole business of sides, and are you this side, are you that side? Sometimes it becomes difficult to even have these conversations, partly also because you're paranoid whether these things will be hijacked for something else, etc. So the historian also has to look within and sort of really brace up and have the courage to say, look, I might be cancelled for saying this, but it's still worth saying it because it's important and it highlights something that people need to think about, people need to discuss, and also go in realizing that you're not always going to be happy with what you find, and you just have to own up and still be led by the evidence instead of arranging the evidence around what you wish is the ideal conclusion.
And I think this side thing is it's completely reading the present into the past, right? Like these sides, when that man or woman existed 200 years back, there would be this entire framework would not exist, right? Like I constantly keep on hearing that Akbar was secular.
Oh, yeah, that word.
Right. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. No. Like it's a meaningless term for him. I mean, he was not. I mean, he might have been a good or a bad man, whatever we want. We can debate and discuss that till kingdom come. But he was not a secular man. He was literally a believer in whatever he believed in. Now you want
and they didn't live in a world where secularism as a concept existed. He was a king. Right? Kings were seen in many ways as divine representation on earth, etc. in different degrees. In some places, they actually saw themselves as God's regents on earth, etc. Even this question of good and bad is so complicated to answer, right? In some settings, he would fit our parameters of what is good, which may not be the parameters of his time as to what a good monarch is supposed to do. In fact, there were critics in his own court who thought that his religious pluralism and his interest in multiple faith traditions, etc., was a bad quality, that he wasn't being an ideal Muslim king by being that kind of a character. Today, on the other hand, there'll be people who say that even though he was say, better than Aurangzeb, he was still violent in certain contexts, etc. So does that make him a bad man because he was violent in certain contexts? Frankly, these are in some ways foolish parameters to apply to historical figures like this, because as you said, just as the word secular is our word, you can't retrospectively project it into Akbar's time. Similarly, these are things that's an emotional engagement.
I think he might even be offended.
For all
like if you really explain the word to him and said you're a secular person, you might have your head chopped. I want to come back to the current moment and politics where we left off at. I think I agree with you that I don't think the politicization of history is particularly nothing new. I think it's always happened. But I also do think that Hindutva is particularly good at it in yoking identity, nationalist identity or communal identity, however you want to cut it, and history. They're so good at it. There's this book by Shoaib Daniyal on this Ghazi Mia. And it's very interesting that in this Sufi scenes Tazkiras, there is an antagonist who's a Hindu king, and he's legendary. But for 100 years, Hindutva has taken him up. He's called Raja Sohaldev and has made him not only into almost a real character in the eyes of people, but has even connected him to castes. So there are now two castes fighting over this.
Whether he was...
and he never existed, right? So that I think, now whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, I really think it's a very skillful thing to do, to connect it so granularly to not only Hindu identity, but in some ways even one cut deeper.
possible, because I think perhaps in earlier generations, while there was political ideology coming into textbooks and things like that, I think it sort of worked still on the basic facts. Like it was about interpreting and understanding those facts. Now I think a lot of the facts themselves are thrown into the air, and you have convenient facts that have been arranged, and sometimes non-facts, untruths that seem to be getting into textbooks, etc., or pure perversions that are taking place. Because again, I think this is partly because this is enabled now, because there's more control over these things, there's more centralization about a lot of these things, and I think that sort of feeds into this. But you're right, I think there's a lot of this. You see a lot of this on Twitter and social media as well. People sometimes like to believe certain things, and sometimes there are historical figures created out of thin air, and that's very much something that's happening now in our time. So yeah, it's a more advanced version of what perhaps happened in a slower, more subtle form earlier.
I think just a couple of days back, I think a minister in Rajasthan said that we've removed the plaque at the Battle of Haldighati to show that Rana Pratap won, and which I found very interesting. Because maybe that is truly not what happened in history, but also I think, as someone pointed out, she's actually a descendant of the Rajput general on the Mughal side. So she's completely, so not only like she's sort of throwing her ancestor down the river, but like there's what was maybe one objective fact of who won a battle now is even that is being contested now, and officially the history has been changed.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, because frankly, if you look at the long arc of Indian history, Indian communities have done this kind of selective remembering of things and a kind of wiping out of other things. That's happened in the past as well. There are cases where communities sometimes in their oral narratives remember certain historical figures in certain way. The difference was that back in the day, this was about specific communities, specific groups here and there. Now what's happened is, with the homogenized kind of identity, with this greater control, with the fact that people in all parts of the country are able to access the same dialogue, are able to be part of essentially the same conversations online, etc., this assumes a very different kind of proportion, and suddenly this becomes the only narrative, or at least it's advanced as the only narrative, when other narratives are dismissed as, okay, now this doesn't matter in our time and age, this is what we're going to focus on, because as this homogenized community, this is going to be our future memory of history. So I think what again used to happen in different ways in different places among different specific groups, now because of the time we live in, and this homogenized identity assumes a very different level and scale, which is what maybe surprises most of us. But if you look at the broad arc of Indian tradition and how we've remembered history often, I think in some ways it fits that formula.
One of the most fascinating examples of this that I've seen online is there is a constant war between Marathas and Rajputs, who was the top dog in medieval India. I think these were local histories that everybody held on to, and suddenly now everybody has these insta battles. And
the Maratha-Rajput feud has been going on since, the 17th century, when they came face to face with each other in a big way.
Yeah.
Many people forget that when they say, oh, the Mughals expanded across India and invaded all parts of India, forget that it was often Rajput generals leading a lot of these armies. It was often Maratha generals also. Once they did penetrate the Deccan, many Maratha families did serve the Mughal state as well. And there's also status issues between the Rajputs and the Marathas, right? The Rajputs were seen as gold standard Kshatriyas, and they looked down on the Marathas. And the Marathas, I think, resented that, and they aspired in many ways to Rajput status as well. So I think it's a combination of all of these, which has been going on from the 17th century, and still, all these hundreds of years later, still plays out, except that now it's playing out online among these online keyboard warriors and smartphone
through
warriors.
Video edits.
And through video edits and really outraged videos, outraged videos on Instagram and stuff.
So this is one of the, I think, great ironies of modern history is that I think Punjabis in Pakistan revere Ghazni. They named missiles after him. He ravaged Punjab, and I think Gujaratis and modern day Rajasthanis revere the Marathas. And I don't think at that time, I think even when they invaded Gujarat, the Marathas were not seen as a force of peace. They were seen as, it was seen as a very chaotic time.
You do see in Savarkar's writings, there is this tension, right? Because at one point he sees the Maratha state as essentially re-establishing Hindu rule after several centuries of Muslim rule. But then he also faces the fact that the Marathas, as they fanned out across India, met with a lot of resistance. And not from Muslims, but from existing local Hindu powers. And it's interesting to see the ways in which he tries to address this, saying that, they were trying to build a national thing. And those who came in the way, had to sort of deal with the consequences of what was meted out to them by the Marathas. Similarly, in the unification of Italy, the Italian revolutionaries did fight some Italians as well. So he tries to sort of place it in that context, in that perspective. But you can see that there is that tension and there is that realization that all said and done, if you look at the nitty-gritties, it's not as romantic as we'd like to think.
In fact, till today, there's a lullaby in Bengali, which basically
famous.
goes, go to sleep, otherwise the Maratha will come.
Yeah. There's a word for it, no, that they use? Is it the
Borgi.
Bargi is, as we put it, in Borgi in Bengal. So, just as a query to myself, I keep thinking, in some ways, much as we may quibble about this, is this also how societies sort of evolve? Is this also how societies move forward? For example, in the evolution of Hinduism, you'll find that there are often these village gods, Grama Devtas, who are very local origins. At some point, with Brahmin exposure, they'll be sort of interpreted as avatars of Vishnu or Parvati or whatever, and they'll become part of the greater narrative. They will retain a lot of local influences, but there'll also be Sanskritic influences now, and there's a fusing. At some point, there was potentially also tension. There's also potentially difference. There are still temple rituals that often hint at tension, at histories of tension, etc. But by fusing and then buying into this narrative, it's also a way to then move to the next level or sort of create a bridge, and then, society's evolved. That God has evolved, their ideas have evolved, and you move on. And there, in that process itself, there is a selective remembering and a selective forgetting. Again, the difference is, in the nationalized version of this, it is the scale. What has always happened at these granular levels, this is at a much bigger scale. So in some ways, it looks daunting for a lot of us, because we're like, oh my God, this is huge, right? This is happening in at this mega scale, and how do we deal with this? Is this the wrong way of dealing with history, etc.? But a lot of people will argue that this is perhaps how society moves forward.
It's always happened.
It's always happened. So
what you said is very fascinating. I have a friend who calls this the federal nature of Hinduism. So I think every time Hinduism or Brahmanical Hinduism enters an area, it will very often absorb local gods by associating them with, very often, Shiva, for example. And I think it's a very fascinating way of, you connect them to the quote-unquote national stream, but that tradition is largely left intact.
And there are, you can see these compromises, as it were. Sometimes you can see arrangements in the rituals of temples. For example, where I come from in Kerala, there are temples where the same deity is worshipped in different forms at different times of the day. There's a temple in North Kerala where there's Brahmins who I think do the afternoon puja, but it's non-Brahmins who do the morning and evening puja. Right. So it's almost like different communities have their claim on the same deity, and at some point they reached an arrangement where they agreed that, okay, this is the time and you guys will do your bit, this is the time and we are entitled to do our bit. A friend of mine was telling me about teyyams that take place. There's a Brahmin family he was describing who have a goddess in the house who requires blood sacrifices. Clearly, not from the Brahmanical tradition, but at the same time, because they're Brahmins, they cannot do a blood sacrifice in the house. So there's a kind of decoy blood that is offered to the deity. Right. And once that ritual is done, by then a Dalit community comes to the yard, and then they perform the teyyam, which is a completely non-Brahmanical version of what might have originally been a tribal religious system. But it's now part of a continuum. Without that, you can't do this, and without this, that is not complete. And that kind of
everybody's
thing.
Got their modus vivendi, and it's kind of functioning. Right?
And India in many ways is still that, right? India in many ways is still that. We're still cobbling together so many things constantly.
On the fly, which is
on the fly. It happens. And I think in some ways there's beauty also in it.
It's a very beautiful thing, I think.
That desire that everything should be streamlined and perfect and have perfect square edges and shapes. I think that again is a modern, tendency to put everything in a neat box. But we are not a neat culture. We are a culture that, as you said, it's federal, it's a conglomerate, it's something that weaves in everything. And for that reason, it's tough to give it one solid shape. And it's a tragedy of our recent or modern history that so many Indian thinkers have been obsessed with putting it in these boxes, because that's the dominant framework we inherited from the West, that it needs to have a box, it needs to have a fixed definition, it cannot be vague. And we I think are still succumbing to a lot of that pressure. Who is a Hindu? What is your identity? What is proper Islam? What is proper Hinduism? Earlier people also asked this question, but everyday lived Hinduism was not necessarily like that. Even now, everyday lived Hinduism is actually very diverse. But there's this urgent quest that there has to be some clear outline for it, which, I can see the political advantages of it. But in other contexts, I think it can also be a bit debilitating and a bit limiting. So again, it is that danda saying, right? Like, this is good Hinduism, this is not, this is deviation. this is corruption. And in some ways that is a Western lens that we've inherited. Of course, this is not to say there weren't purists within the Hindu fold. If you look at the broad arc of the last 1,000 years, you will always find voices within the Hindu tradition that have been hyper puritanical, which have always frowned on a lot of these what we call syncretic forms of faith and religion, etc. But the broad spectrum, you find that they do many things constantly. In my last book called Gods, Guns and Missionaries, there's a segment that the gentleman eventually becomes a Christian convert, but he refers to how the women in the family kept vows on Muharram, but they also went to the temple. His father read the Jnaneshwari, which is a commentary on the Gita in Marathi, but his uncle used to go to a Sufi shrine. And Brahmins came to their house to participate in non-vegetarian rituals, which the Brahmins could not do in their own house, because these guys were not vegetarians, and these guys were not Brahmins. They belonged to a community of smiths called Kasars. And how they used to consume meat, but because they lived in a relatively upper caste neighborhood, they used to have code words for it, like, oh, these are water beans for fish and things like that. So it's interesting that growing up, he says that this was the spectrum of religious practices that was there. He was very conscious that he wasn't a Muslim or he wasn't a Christian and all of that, but he, at the same time, his lived experience was very diverse and very mixed up. Yet what's interesting is he concludes saying that when I grew up, I realized that, this is all very confusing and it's all very scattered. And that's why he eventually moves to Christianity, which gives him a more streamlined view of life, etc. So you see the yearning for streamlining, which is there in him, but at the same time, his lived experience as recently as the 19th century was far more complicated. So yes, I think there is a trend now to, sort of encourage and push a very purist, a very rigid reading of Hinduism. Whether it will succeed or not is debatable, as I like to be an optimist. I think, shrillness and loudness sometimes also reflects a kind of insecurity as opposed to strength. So I think it clearly shows that enough people have not bought into this, which is why people need to be shrill, which is why people need to be loud, and which is why people need a danda in their hand to make people listen. But at the same time, I'm also aware that if the state buys into some of this, if the state starts actively promoting some of this, it does lead to real-world consequences. You have cases in Maharashtra where at one point the Peshwa government says that, at I think Pandharpur, if I'm not mistaken, at one point Dalits could come till that monument to Chokha Mela,
right,
which was just outside the main temple. But Brahmins entering would feel polluted by the presence of Dalits there. So they were ordered to move to a different space further away. But it tells you that as recently as the 18th century, they had access right till the front, if not inside the temple, at least till the front. And it's only the 18th century that they were barred and pushed to a more distant location. So when the state gets involved, despite my optimism, it's possible that this can go down in strange directions. But I always like to believe that ultimately a large quantity of people like India and a large and, as I said, still pretty amorphous community like Hindus, it's very difficult to regiment in this very sarkari way. It'll be tough to pull that off, at least in our lifetime, is my feeling, or in some ways maybe my hope.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of amorphousness in Hinduism, just of your latest book, Guns, Gods and Missionaries. One of the things that I found very interesting that you put across is that there are these immense, vast number of streams that are going along, right? But it seems that the only people interested in sort of putting all the streams together are Brahmins, right? So otherwise everybody is doing their own thing, but Brahmins are coming and sort of, say, connecting Vitthal to a sort of Puranic god. And in Bengal, it's very interesting, there's this snake goddess called Manasa. She's connected to Shiva. But the thing is, her worship really survives in a very intense way, and she can get very, very angry if you don't worship her. So how does this work? So, it's throughout India, how are these streams being collected?
So again, it's not as if the Brahmins are one monolithic group that went out with an agenda. It's just that somewhere in their tradition, there was this strange phenomenon, I suppose, again, in our perception, where they were willing to accept a lot of local traditions, so long as the local traditions also accepted certain parts of the fare that they were offering. And that's how you reach this strange compromise where gods get married and then they become reinterpreted in one reading as versions of Puranic gods. Although locally people will still be worshipping it under the local name. So you find these there's an overlap that takes place, and there's a co-option. Again, it brings to mind that word you use, federalism, kind of conglomerate culture, saying we will not deny everything, but we will reach certain compromises and we will reach certain understandings that allow part of your culture to come into this, and you have to accept certain elements of our culture. But Brahmins are the ones who, at least in the way I've seen it, they are able to synthesize a lot of this And in the synthesis, although it's happening locally, they also make it part of a grand narrative, often in the Sanskrit language, etc. So there is a tendency in Brahmanical culture to also place this not in a united narrative, but in a united framework. They construct a framework that allows for slots for all of these diversities to exist, which is quite fascinating. It's tough to answer as to why this emerged and when this emerged exactly, but clearly through the Puranic period, this was happening. A framework was created that accepted diversity. It had its politics. Some gods were seen as inferior and lower in the orthodox reading. Some gods were seen as higher. Vishnu had his adherents who competed with Shiva's adherents. There was politics and there was competition and rivalry even. But at the same time, there was a slow crafting of a kind of common framework. Which is why also when I think a lot of Dalit intellectuals often talk about how, especially in the, forget now, in the early 20th century, in the non-Brahmin movement in South India, there were actually voices that said that actually we prefer British rule because nationalism is essentially a cloak for Brahmin rule. It will just allow Brahmin elites to continue, etc. And leaving aside your personal views on this, one of the reasons that Brahmanical idea of Hinduism was so easy to also nationalize is precisely because it had this uniting tendency. It already had the ingredients you needed for nationalism to naturally, I don't know if naturally is the right word, but to fit relatively better.
You could graft it onto that
easier. Relatively easily. And it became easier for Hindus also to articulate nationalism, often in a Hindu idiom, because that pan-Indian Brahmanical narrative or that framework allowed for the shared elements to be emphasized and the diversity to not be seen as a liability. Where the British and others, for example, would claim that there is no nation here. These people are so diverse, how can they be a nation? But because there were these threads, often slender threads, but there were those threads that were Brahmanical in nature, it created an infrastructure that could be nationalized in the 19th and 20th centuries. So again, it's not a question of good or bad. It's just that the Brahmanical narrative always had the strength and it had the capacity to serve these modern purposes, which may be why it was reinforced and became even stronger in the modern period. Because it served very modern.
Yeah, I was reading, I think sometime back that the great Punjabi ballad Heer Ranjha. So it's actually, I don't know how many people know, but it's a ballad of Punjabi Muslims. Both Heer and Ranjha are Punjabi Muslims, but when they fix up marriages and all, they actually consult Brahmins, because those are the only guys who can tell you the right tithi to do a marriage, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're Muslim, but I think it also depended on class and caste, because they were landlords. So a landlord always consults a Brahmin. So whether you're...
And it's not just Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, for example. I remember, I think it's Harjat Oberoi's work, or was it Arvind Pal Mandai? Basically one of these two scholars, or both their works perhaps, they also talk about how at one point the distinction between what you would now describe as Hindu practice and Sikh practice was a bit more porous. There were, even in Ranjit Singh's court, they had Brahmin astrologers, they did patronize temples, there were Sikhs who visited temples. Yes, there were also purist Sikhs from the beginning who believed that this should not be done. But there were also large chunks of Sikhs who did go to Hindu temples, who did have family connections to Hindu shrines, etc. Again, it's from the 19th century, etc. As Hindu identity starts formalizing itself and those outer borders start emerging, the Sikhs also realize that we don't want to be subsumed into this. So they also start defining their outer borders more clearly, more distinctly, to separate themselves and not be drawn into or absorbed into the Hindu fold. So it's not just what you see as religions that have come from outside. It is also religions born within the subcontinent. Again, at one point like a spectrum with porous boundaries, it's not entirely clear, or the boundaries are fuzzy. And then there's a kind of clarification of where exactly the boundaries lie in the modern period. And then we've been living since then, imagining retrospectively that these communities were always like this.
I think this is, I remember reading about this in Sri Lanka, where after, this sort of Sinhala-Tamil tension takes place, I think a lot of the Hindu and Buddhist shrines were there was a lot of cross, everybody just went wherever, depending on what they wanted.
Yeah.
But once the conflict broke out, I think starting from the 50s, there was a partitioning on religious lines. I think a lot of people look at the Sri Lankan conflict as ethnic, which it is. But there are also some
religious inflections,
major religious inflections, right? It's also Sinhala majoritarianism. Sorry, it's also Buddhist majoritarianism of a sort. I want to go back to the Hindutva point that we were talking about. So you said Hindutva is particularly good at doing this politicization. I completely agree. And if
actually, can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
You said Hindutva is good at doing the politicization. I'm thinking, in some ways, maybe it's more attuned to how historically Indian communities have dealt with history, which is to have a very malleable remembering and forgetting of things.
Yeah.
And it's just understood that well, and at some level, at its extremes, weaponized that tendency, which is why so many people are able to get on board with it. Whereas I think on the other side, the secular forces, etc., we are so fixated on the footnoted version of history that has no emotional resonance, right? You can't make in my book, I can like puncture many holes, but that doesn't tell a good story. Ultimately, what moves society? A good narrative, a good story. Who's telling you, who's creating the more compelling narrative? And if they are able to use a tradition that in some ways we already had in the way we interpreted history historically, and then sort of nationalize it and play along those rules, we may see it as a bad thing because we are seeing that, oh, history should not be dealt with this way. But I don't think that academic sense of how you do history is ever going to influence the way communities deal with history. And when you're in the game of politics and you're in the game of communities, those are the parameters on which even those who have an interest in footnoted good history have to be able to construct a compelling way to communicate that so that people can invest in it. I can't keep throwing footnotes at people saying that,
Do you think there's a failure of academic history in India?
I don't know if it's a failure because, again, academics didn't set out to help communities imagine themselves consciously in a certain way, or they didn't set out to give people a good story, right? They were studying history in an objective sense, or at least that was the aspiration. But I think, yes, in some ways, maybe there was a disconnect in understanding that in the way history and the public interact, where that interaction takes place, there needs to be a kind of bridge that explains why this matters, why the footnotes matter, why are we doing this, and that communication perhaps hasn't always been effective. It's perhaps existed in these silos and spaces in which everybody understands why history is being done a certain way. But I don't think a large bulk of people have ever understood the point of this or engaged necessarily with this. And there wasn't too much desire on this side perhaps to invest in convincing the public of the importance of why serious inquiry in history matters, maybe.
I think something as basic as, one is constructing a good narrative, but just sometimes maybe talking not in English, although it's an ironical point given we're talking in English right now.
I can speak Malayalam too.
Yeah, you can, so then we won't be able to talk.
Yeah, exactly. That's why India needs English.
So, but the thing is, I think it's important. Like, you do a lot of Malayalam stuff, and I think that's incredible that you're talking to a core group in their own language in a way that I think you'll reach out to them that will never happen in English. I think till I think a generation back it used to happen in Bengali actually. It's kind of stopped.
My Malayalam isn't perfect in the sense that I have what I call household Malayalam. So I don't have literary Malayalam. In fact, when people throw
very different
literary Malayalam at me, sometimes I get confused.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily, I get the gist of what they're saying, but I'm a bit overwhelmed by it. But I think the good thing is when I do these Malayalam talks and when I'm giving these Malayalam interviews and so on, it reaches a very different segment of readers. In English, you're typically targeting your urban aspirational crowd who are to some degree or the other familiar with English, they've gone to English schools and all of that. When I'm doing Malayalam, I'm reaching kids and readers in smaller towns, in villages often. The English ones will appeal to people in Bombay and Pune and Delhi and wherever. But to appeal to somebody in Kottarakara in Kerala, to appeal to somebody in Mavelikara in Kerala, it has to be Malayalam. And I think that in some ways it's empowered me to keep doing more of this because I've realized that I'm actually reaching a very different segment here.
Do you think your identity as a Malayali informs your history writing?
Perhaps it has. But the thing is, I'm also this strange mix, right? I am a Malayali. My parents are from Kerala. Every year we used to spend several months in Kerala. I used to run to Kerala on every occasion. I got Diwali vacations, summer vacations, Christmas vacations. Everything I got, I would run to Kerala. And to a village that too. Not to the towns. I used to live in a village and know everybody there. We'd go running in the fields and things like that. So there was that. But the rest of the time I was in Maharashtra. So yes, there has been a Kerala influence and, so a bunch of people will say I've been influenced by the lefty culture of Kerala. But equally, I grew up in Maharashtra. I speak Marathi as well. I read Marathi as well. And I grew up in a culture where we always called Savarkar Veer Savarkar growing up. Because in Maharashtra, and not just BJP supporters, across the board, generally speaking, including, say, lots of Congress families or whatever, while on that side of the equation, they may not approve of Savarkar's Hindutva, Savarkar's revolutionary phase is respected. He is seen as somebody who had a heroic phase in his life. And for that reason, as a schoolboy, I remember being taken by my school to watch a movie on Savarkar in Marathi at a theatre that came out in the early 2000s or something. So that's also the culture I grew up in. And I was having a conversation
in fact, one of the things that you write in your book and really resonated with me is that obviously Savarkar is hated by a section of the left and the centre for his ideology. But I'm always very uncomfortable when people make fun of his mercy petition because I don't know what I would do if someone put me for hard labour, tortured for 10 years, 15 years in an island in the middle of the ocean, and he's doing it for his nationalistic. I might obviously don't agree with what he did after he got out. But I think it's a bit mean to pick on him for that.
It is mean. I think one reason people do it is partly because in Savarkar's subsequent writings, he often has a hypermasculine tone, right? So then people are like, oh, that's a bit ironic that you wrote mercy petitions. But all the same, come on, we can be bigger than poking at somebody, criticize his ideology, criticize his beliefs. But when you're in jail for over a decade and it's a jail that has these horrible things happening and you're essentially treated like an animal and you have to work on an oil mill and things like that. And it's torture. When your weight goes down, you're barely getting anything to eat. It's not pleasant. I wouldn't judge somebody like that because we weren't in those circumstances. Remember, historically also, several people have written what we would call mercy petitions. The wording and the language may not be entirely supplicant, but the substance is the same, which is that I will agree to certain terms if you will release me. So I think this mercy petitions business is a bit, it's not the strongest stick with which to critique Savarkar. You've got enough to critique Savarkar on. This will get you social media marks and likes. If you're into that game, then yes, Savarkar wrote mercy petitions.
It's a nice gotcha, basically.
It's a gotcha moment. But beyond that, if I think it's a bit unnecessary. It's the weakest point of criticism against Savarkar, that he wrote mercy petitions when he was being tortured. Come on.
I want to jump off from this into, so a lot of your book deals with the making of modern Hindu identity, right? How is Hindutva being constructed? I mean, Savarkar is a part of your book. But I was a bit confused as to why he was a part of your book. So I wanted to understand, like, how are people like Savarkar feeding off this age? Like one of the things that I really find fascinating about Savarkar, I think you've also mentioned in your book, is that he was a quote-unquote rationalist, right? I think he once mocked Gandhi for being a vegetarian, right? I think
he mocked people who worshipped the cow.
Right? Yeah. In fact, when you say that Savarkar is seen in a good light by people by Congressites, I think in Maharashtra even there would be some Ambedkarites who would not treat him
entirely. I would not be surprised.
Very anathema given his caste work. So how is Hindutva coming out of this milieu?
So the book itself is actually about modern Hinduism, and again, because of our present day dynamics, majority minority Hindu-Muslim conflict over the last 100 years, etc., we tend to view Hindutva and the modern Hindu identity through the Hindu-Muslim prism. And of course, the long encounter with Islam does have a role to play in how Hindu self-images sort of developed and evolved over the centuries. But the shape modern Hinduism takes in many ways is also influenced by Christianity, colonialism, and that mold of what a religion ought to look like. So that's what I set out to sort of investigate, which is how did Christian missionaries and the encounter for 400 years with Christianity affect the shape of modern Hinduism in the 19th century, etc. Now, in that, ultimately, I bring in Hindutva only as the final chapter. So, Hindutva is a piece of the puzzle, but it is not the culmination of the story. It is one outcrop or an outburst, outgrowth of this modern phenomenon that's taking place, but it is not the summation. It would have been difficult to ignore Hindutva because, again, Hindutva also has its own grievances against Christian mission work. Even today in our tribal belts in Jharkhand and Orissa and places like that, the RSS is not very favorable to Christian missionaries. I was reading Srinath Raghavan's latest book on Indira Gandhi, I think, and somewhere in that, if I'm not mistaken, it was in that book, where he has this passing mention of how, at one point the Congress government believed that the CIA was funding missionaries to sort of keep the Northeast unstable and things like that. So clearly, the idea of the missionary as an extension of colonialism continued even into post-independence India. At the Hindu side, suspicion of the missionary existed among Savarkar, among Tilak, earlier generations of Hindu nationalists, earlier generation of Hindu thinkers, starting from Raja Ram Mohan Roy onwards. In many ways, they were responding to the missionary critique. In many ways, they were responding to the presence of the colonial white man, who increasingly seemed to support the evangelical cause. And Hindutva also at some level in its definition of self. When Tilak tries to define Hindutva, he defines it, of course, as belief in the Vedas, but he also says belief in multiple paths to God. And that is a statement that Hindus have always made against the Christian missionaries over the last 300 odd years. And I thought that was an interesting thread, right? That Tilak also felt that to be a Hindu, that was an essential belief, that you had to believe in multiple paths and reject the idea that there was only one path to God, or there was one single highway to get to the ultimate message and so on. So Christianity in that way did influence the rise of Hindutva as well. Although in Hindutva's political muscularity, on the ground, it is the Muslim who's typically seen as the other, because the Muslims' numbers are far more intimidating, again in quotes, to the Hindu or the Hindutva figure than the Christian. The Christian is seen as the opening wedge of an ideological threat in terms of how you perceive religion, how your religion might be attacked, what is seen as good and what is seen as bad, etc. The Muslim is seen as a living presence in your midst, as the enemy within. So both exist in the Hindutva imaginary, and how they sort of visualize, themselves and the place of other religions.
Also, maybe the missionaries are so spectacularly unsuccessful in actually converting Indians, right? Like you were talking about Raja Ram Mohan Roy.
Yeah.
He interacts extensively with the missionaries, but never actually becomes
He doesn't. But the thing is, if you look at his idea of reforming Hinduism, he's borrowing a Christian template. Just as the Protestants claim that...
To protect against the missionaries.
Yeah, because I think ideologically, in the colonial period where white Christian men are ruling you, the presence of the missionary, even though the numbers of conversions were never big, the missionary seemed a much bigger threat in many ways, because there was power in the hands of the white man and the white state. And the missionary seemed to be an extension. And in many cases, the missionary was an extension of that project. So that is why they were responding often, and they saw the missionary as a threat. So it wasn't necessarily just numbers. The numbers game comes in when the British start doing their censuses and create this concept of majority and minority in India, where the Hindus wake up to the realization that we're a majority, except in cases like Bengal, where they assumed they were a majority and discovered that Muslims are actually the majority in the undivided Bengal. And the Muslims, who have this historical memory that, oh, we were a ruling class, heirs to the Mughals, all of that, discover that in sheer numbers they're actually a minority, and they might be overwhelmed by what they now see as this dangerous Hindu majority. So both sides start playing that game of minority and numbers and all of that. That's when that threat sort of overtakes the conversation. In Ram Mohan's generation, etc., the numbers game hadn't come in necessarily, and it was the white man that was seen as the bigger threat. But in the later period, and especially as the freedom struggle advanced, the idea that if the British leave, what happens to the country? Once that question becomes more and more realistic and more achievable, that's where the question of, oh wait, who will actually end up controlling the country comes in. There the Muslim becomes the main threat.
I want to go back to this, you were discussing, making of stories, right? And it's very interesting, one of the most powerful way in which Hindutva has actually pushed its stories in the recent past is Bollywood. In fact, when you were talking about the Rajputs, one of the most bizarre things about Chhawa is that the Mughals are shown without the Rajputs. They are a purely Muslim state.
Yeah.
So every courtier, right, so there are no Hindus or Rajputs in the administration. So they do the little bit of tinkering to...
If I'm not mistaken, one of the loves of Aurangzeb's life was a Hindu woman.
Right.
Yeah. Forget her name, but yeah.
So... this is really powerful, right? Because you're seeing these very emotional scenes. I think people are getting really whipped up, and that's a true emotion, whether we disagree with the facts of the matter or not.
Yeah, I think Bollywood has certainly seen where the money is. They've seen where the political sort of tendencies lie. I don't think all of these calculations work out. There have also been, let's say, Hindutva-friendly movies that have flopped spectacularly, because I think there's a saturation point that people also reach. On the other side, yes, people are clearly investing in stories, and they're pulling out resources from stories that they see as something that will threaten the establishment, something that will threaten or displease the people in power and things like that. So to that extent, it exists. But again, while Bollywood has a lot of influence at that level, any kind of dissenting voice always thrives in smaller pockets throughout history. It's always been the case, because the overwhelming numbers will always go with the wind, right? Like wherever the wind is blowing, people will tend to lean in that direction. The ones who still sort of stand erect and think for themselves in some ways and try to resist that tendency are always doing it in relative isolation. And you have poets, you have comedians, you have interesting people using entertainment in interesting ways. In some ways, they're paying the price for it also, whether it's trolling, whether it's arrest warrants, whatever it is. But there are people also doing that. So I think sometimes in times of pressure, you have great innovation, you have creative forms of standing up to that pressure as well. Sometimes the weak do not necessarily have hard weapons, but they have creative weapons. You know, the notion of weapons of the weak is that you can use humor to your advantage. You can use other forms to your advantage when you've been disempowered from using all the traditional mainstream sources of influence. So again, I see this as, you know, there's a hope. You know, there is plenty to see there. And in the long run, I think if Bollywood just keeps producing these formulaic movies, it's Bollywood that's going to suffer. And also remember, this country is not just Bollywood. Just because it caters to the Hindi heartland and the Hindi majority, there's so much happening in Malayalam cinema. There's so much happening in Bengali cinema, in Tamil Nadu, in other, you know, bhashas in the country. They have their own film industries. They're having interesting dialogues and conversations. The Great Indian Kitchen was originally a Malayalam movie with Nimisha Sajain in it, talking about marriage, you know, the menstruation, taboos around it, and a woman's experience. And that conversation is happening. It's an interesting film, and it's a film that people loved. It got remade into Hindi and all of that. That came out of Kerala. Similarly, you know, Marathi films are doing very well as well. So I would not exaggerate. While Bollywood is influential, there's things happening that are not Bollywood, and there's plenty of avenues to be hopeful. And for people who are not keen to swing in the direction of where power lies, they have avenues where they can also.
And they have a market.
There is a market.
Like the Great Indian Kitchen is a successful
Nobody
film.
thought it would have a market.
Money, right?
Yeah, nobody thought it would have a market. I think it first released on a relatively obscure platform and then got acquired by Prime because people were watching it and it went viral and things like that.
And there's a Mark Twain quote, everything that you can say about India, the opposite is also
true.
True.
Yeah.
I'm going to end off, this has been a fascinating conversation, Manu. I'm going to end off with a couple of questions. I know you historians always say you have no favorites and all. But if you had to invite 5 people,
good Lord,
to your dinner party,
this you should have asked me. Told me yesterday. I'd have come prepared.
I should have told you, no? But that's fine. That this is the beauty. You've got to just on the spot. 5 people, and they don't have to be good people, but people
historical figures
that you would want to chat with for an hour.
I mean,
you can pick figures from your books.
No, that'd be a bit predictable. There was this character called Ivan the Terrible. It's just I like his name, Ivan the Terrible. I think, you know, to have that name is just amazing. So I'd like to meet Ivan the Terrible. That would be interesting. Definitely one of the Medici queens of Europe, because they were all like very capable, and they were women who managed to operate this very patriarchal setup. So, and we have plenty of examples in India as well.
Machiavellian, how do you pronounce that word?
Yeah, very much. In India, I think somebody like Akbar would be very interesting to meet. Definitely Shivaji Maharaj from Maharashtra, again an interesting figure. So that's 4 people, thank God. And one last one, I think among freedom fighters,
I want somebody from the 20th century.
Yeah, all said and done, frankly, Ambedkar would be a great person to talk to. Nehru would be a very interesting person to talk to. But I think what Gandhi achieved means, you know, that I would probably want to, if I had only one seat left at the table, that presiding figure would then probably be Gandhi, because I still, for all his limitations, many of which he himself acknowledged, it's quite fascinating that in a time without literacy and social media, that many people didn't even have radios, nothing. He managed to galvanize tens of millions of people and got them to come out. And of course, it required social coalitions. It required sometimes looking the other way on caste. It required many, many compromises, as it were. Yet it achieved something that few people at that time, ordinary people, would have been able to pull off.
And I think we forget as to how many anxieties Gandhi's mass mobilization at that time produced.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of thing around Jinnah and Gandhi being opposed. And some of this is presented in some secular, non-secular. Jinnah didn't want, but I think Jinnah just didn't want so many poor people in the room. Like he wanted this to be this Oxford debating society, which it was till then. I think he was just, you know, he was just freaked out by so many people in dhotis around him. Like he wasn't that. He had worked very hard to become India's.
And for Gandhi to get the dhoti-clad people to take an interest and to become part of this, he had to become dhoti-clad and he had to speak a relatively religiousized language in order to appeal to them. He couldn't again go out, as I said,
and which is like a bit of an act. Gandhi is a very elite man, right?
He's an elite man from privilege, but he's able to speak a language they understand. So his use of the word Ram Rajya is because he wants them to understand what he's trying to communicate. He can't come and say, oh, the democratic state in a country where people don't understand, what those words even signify. But if I had him at the table, I would also ask him about how he thought of the theatrics of politics, because he's also very good at planning
the master.
his theatrical sort of cinematic elements of politics. The Dandi March, they made sure the world press was there. They made sure that it was something that would be, the photographs would be flashed around the world. It wasn't just, oh, I'm going to go make some salt. It was, I'm going to make some salt, but I need an audience. So he understood the theatrics of it.
When my history teacher taught it, I think he was quite right. She said when he went to the coast, what he picked up was mud. It wasn't salt, but
it wasn't.
Just the entire, drama of it.
Yeah, it was a drama.
He was the master of that, right?
Yeah. And politics even today, I think a good part of the formula is drama. It is being able to appeal to people by creating that visual sense, by creating that sense of that energy, that mood and all of that. Something the Prime Minister is a winner at. And our opposition leaders, at least the one at the national level, seem to struggle with creating that kind of energy.
And sometimes this is presented as a bad thing, but I think for a democratic leader who's a link between the state and the people, it's a core skill. It's like,
it's a political skill.
You have to have it.
It's not a question of whether you like it or not.
You have
the question is, you are ultimately performing and playing the role of a public icon and playing the role of this figure. There is the man and then there is the figure.
There's the figure.
What people are looking up to is not necessarily the man. They also want to see a leader, and the leader has to perform. This is why kings have historically ridden elephants and come out decked in emeralds and diamonds, because the king can't be seen as an ordinary figure. The king can't be seen as somebody you'll sit down and have a meal with. The king has to look extraordinary in order for him to be in the position that he is and command the kind of resources and respect and fear even to sort of be effective. And I think modern politicians, the effective ones, know this. Even at state level, the more charismatic ones have always been fairly good at the theatrics of it. Your home state of Bengal, Mamata Banerjee understands how to play the cinematic side and the dramatic side of politics as well.
Gandhi, get along as goat maybe. Thank you so much,
Thank you for having
Manu.
me.
This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for watching, viewers. If you like the journalism that we do, I urge you to go to scroll.in/contribute so that we could continue to do the work that we do. Thank you for watching. I'm Shoaib Daniyal.